Today on Capecchi's Corner, we're going to look at properties of parallelograms. We're going to look at a few theorems, but first we have to define what a parallelogram is. It's a quadrilateral, which means it's four sides, with both pairs of opposite sides parallel. So the markings you'll see, that shows that these opposite sides are parallel, they have one arrow, and to show that these other opposite pairs are also parallel, you'll see two arrows there. Now the first theorem is that opposite sides of parallelograms are congruent. So once we know a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, we know that the opposite sides are congruent. So it says right here that EF is congruent to HG, so there's our marking, and HE is congruent to GF. Our next theorem states that opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent. So for instance, angle 2 is going to be congruent to angle R, and angle Q is going to be congruent to angle S. Our next theorem states that diagonals of a parallelogram bisect each other. So we can say that TM is congruent to MR and QM is congruent to MS. Now notice that although they bisect each other, that doesn't necessarily mean that the diagonals are equal. They could be equal, but it doesn't happen all the time. Let's do a quick summary of what we know now about parallelograms. The definition states that a quadrilateral with both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. The first theorem talks about the fact that opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent. We also know that opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent. And our last theorem states that diagonals of a parallelogram bisect each other. Since we're working with parallelograms, we know that we're talking about parallel lines. So a few things to remember, that if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then alternate interior angles are congruent, corresponding angles are congruent, and same side interior angles are supplementary. We're going to take a look at some parallelograms, and we're going to be asked to find the missing values. So in our first example, I have opposite sides are parallel because it's a parallelogram. So I know that X and 65 are corresponding angles. So I know X is going to be 65. I know that angle A and angle C are opposite angles, so that means that they're congruent, so that also gives Y a value of 65. Now if I were to extend this transversal, I can see that Z and 65 are same side interior angles, so if I take 180 and I minus 65, that gives me 115, which I know is the value for Z. In looking at our next example, again, I notice that I have opposite angles, so they're congruent, so that gives X a value of 56. I also know, remember we have parallel lines on either side, that Z and 85 are alternate interior angles. So that means that they're congruent, so that gives Z a value of 85. And I also know that 56 and Y plus 85 gives me 180 because they're same side interior angles. So if I add those together, 56 plus 85 plus Y is equal to 180. And then if I solve, I have Y is equal to 39. So that's my measurement for Y. In our next parallelogram, I know that diagonals bisect each other, so I can set up some equations. I know that 3x plus 4 is equal to 25, and 2y minus 8 is equal to 28. Well, I can solve them separately, so my first one I'm going to bring forward to the other side. I have 3x is equal to 21, so x is equal to 7. The next thing I can do is solve for y in my other equation, and I have 2y is equal to 36, so y is equal to 18. Now a great thing about these is I can check them since I know that diagonals bisect each other. So if I'm looking at my value for x, if I substitute that in, 3 times 7 plus 4 gives me 21 plus 4, which is 25, which is what I want because the other side is 25. If I do the same thing for y, substitute 18, so I have 2 times 18 minus 8, that gives me 36 minus 8, which is 28, which again is what I want because that's what I have on my other side of my diagonal. In our next example, we have the sides of our parallelogram labeled, and since we know that opposite sides are congruent, we can say 4x minus y is equal to 24, and we can also say 2x plus y is equal to 36. Now, elimination is probably the best way to solve this since we have two equations and two variables. So if I add 4x and 2x, I get 6x. I have negative y plus y gives me 0, and 24 plus 36 gives me 60. So I know that the value for x is equal to 10. To find my value for y, I can substitute it into either equation. So if I take 2 times 10 plus y is equal to 36, that gives me 20 plus y is equal to 36, so y is equal to 16. Now I can double check my work by substituting these values back in. So in my bottom there I have 2 times 10 plus 16. That gives me 36 for that side of that parallelogram, which is what I'm supposed to get since my top there is 36. If I go on my other side, I have 4 times 10 minus 16, which gives me 24, which is what I have on the other side. So by checking, I know that my values for x and y are correct. In our last problem today, we're asked to find the measure of the angles. So I have measure of angle 1 is equal to 42, measure of angle 2 is equal to x squared, and the measure of angle 3 is equal to 13x. So I know that 1 and 2 together are going to equal 3 because opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent. So that gives me x squared plus 42 is equal to 13x. Now again, I have x to the second power, so that means I'm going to bring everything to one side and try to factor. So I subtract 13x from both sides. And when I factor, I'm looking at the second sign first. Signs are the same. They're both negative, so I get negative and negative. X and x. Factors of 42 that when I add together I get 13 is going to be 6 and 7. So if I have x minus 7 and times x minus 6 is equal to 0, that means either of those could be equal to 0 themselves. That gives me x is either equal to 7 or x is equal to 6. So I have to see if both answers will work. So first we have x is equal to 7, so let's see if that works. So I have 42, that's measure angle 1, plus 7 squared, which is 49, is equal to 13 times 7, which gives you 91. And that's a true statement, so I know that x is equal to 7 is an answer that will work. Let's try x is equal to 6. We'll do the same thing. We have 42 plus 6 squared is 36 is equal to 13 times 6, which is 78, which is also a true statement. So I know my answers to this problem are x is equal to 7 and x is equal to 6. So the question asks, find the measure of angle 2. Well, angle 2 is x squared, so then my final answer there is going to be either 49 or 36.